Hello, everyone. Greetings and welcome. My name is Adele Halliday. I serve at the General Counsel Office as the Anti-Racism and Equity Lead, and I am the coordinator for this 40 Days program. So welcome to this live event for the 40 Days of Engagement on Anti-Racism. We are glad that you are here. For this evening, we will be exploring the United Nations and the future of people of African descent. We will be hearing from Michael McEachrane, and he is a member and the Rapporteur of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. He's an international activist for the human rights of people of African descent, as well as a researcher in Black studies, human rights studies, and postcolonialism. And as an activist, he has, among other things, co-founded several civil society organizations, and he's been deeply involved in the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, as well as the establishment of the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent and European Union recognition of the fundamental rights of people of African descent. And Michael will be joining us by video shortly. Tonight, we're also thrilled that we also will have Barbara Reynolds with us. And Barbara Reynolds is the chairperson of the United Nations Working Group of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. And Barbara will be with us live, sharing ideas and insights, and is open to responding to questions. And Barbara Reynolds is also the Vice President for Administration, Advancement, and Planning at the University of the Southern Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago. She served as Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Guyana from August 2014 to September 2019. And prior to this, she was the head of education for Save the Children UK after having spent the past 2 decades with UNICEF, working in areas of program management and representational roles. She began her professional career as a teacher and continues to be involved in education. She's also an active human rights professional and an experienced human rights and gender mainstreaming facilitator. So we're delighted that Barbara is with us as well. So welcome to Michael and Barbara. This event is in the broader context of the 40 Days of Engagement on Anti-Racism. And this full week, there are explorations of people of African descent and the topics of anti-Black racism. There are some written reflections available online from Deborah and Albertine. Albertine's reflection explores when hope meets indifference, and Deborah's explores emancipate yourself. There are also several featured books. So throughout the 40 days, we have a full book collection that are available on the United Church Bookstore. And all of these books are available if you go to ucrdstore.ca. And then if you use a drop-down menu for the 40 Days of Engagement on Anti-Racism, and any of these books are available for ordering. This week in particular, though, we are lifting up 2 books. One is called There's Something in the Water, and it explores environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities in Canada. The other book that we are lifting up is called Are You Calling Me a Racist? And it explores why we need to stop talking about race and start making anti-racist change. These books and more are available at the United Church Bookstore. There's a discount code for 40 days that's valid for 20% off orders of 2 or more books. And so all of these are available on the website for the 40 days. As well, available there is signing up for the newsletter if you're interested in and gathering that and keeping up to date that way. So welcome once again. We are glad you're here. And with that, we will move into hearing a little bit from Michael and his reflections around the United Nations and the future of people of African descent.
Greetings, everyone, and good evening to you all. My name is Michael McEachrane, and I am one of the 10 members and the rapporteur of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. I'm terribly sorry that I cannot be with you live today. But I'm very glad that Barbara Reynolds, the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, will be leading today's conversation with you. I would like to begin first by thanking the United Church of Canada for inviting me to speak at this session, and especially Adele, who I know since before. Thank you, Adele, for inviting me to speak about the forum. So let me say a few words about the Permanent Forum, and I will leave it up to Barbara Reynolds to talk about the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. So just to give a very brief and general history of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, it is an extension or an outcome, one can say, of the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, which stated in its program of activities for the decade that a permanent forum, or a forum rather, on people of African descent should be established. And the permanent forum is an outcome of that. The International Decade for People of African Descent, which runs from 2014, 2015 until this year, 2024, is in turn an outcome or a result of the Third World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, and its outcome, which was the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which is the world's most comprehensive human rights instrument against racism and racial discrimination, and second in importance, or legally anyway, from the only international convention against racial discrimination, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, also known as the ICERD, from 1965. So yes, the General Assembly decided to establish the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in August 2021, which was on the 20th anniversary of the Durban Conference and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The Permanent Forum is to act as a consultative mechanism and a global platform for people of African descent and other relevant stakeholders across the world to discuss the socioeconomic development and the human rights of people of African descent across the world, and to offer advice and recommendations on people of African descent to the entire UN system and all its member states. And the Permanent Forum has so far had 3 annual sessions. The first session was held in Geneva in December 2022. The second session was held in New York in April 2023. And the third session was held earlier this year, again in Geneva in April. And we have so far produced 2 reports to the Human Rights Council and General Assembly, which is then an outcome of our sessions. The first report was presented to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council last year, and was an outcome of was based on the 2 first sessions, and the second report was presented to the Human Rights Council last week, I believe it was, and will be presented to the General Assembly, I believe, in 2 weeks' time. And so the sessions, the 3 first sessions, have been huge events, I would say, and a big success. The last event in Geneva had over 1,000 participants from across the world, and this is the largest gathering at the UN of its kind. And the Permanent Forum has already proven to be, if you will, a historic forum, and the kind of forum that our Pan-African and anti-colonial forebearers dreamt of. And now it is a reality. It is the largest global platform and forum for people of African descent, about people of African descent in the world. And although the UN defines people of African descent in terms of basically Black people in the diaspora outside of Africa, the Permanent Forum has made it very clear that it's Pan-African in its vision, and that the work of the Permanent Forum also should and will include, and already does include, Africans on the continent, and the many issues that people of African descent in the diaspora and Africans on the continent have in common. Among the themes that have been discussed at the 3 first sessions, and that have been included in the 2 first reports to the UN and its member states, are systemic and structural racism, reparatory justice for histories and legacies of enslavement and colonialism, transnational migration, education, health, yes, and several other themes, such as also the second UN International Decade for People of African Descent, which will most likely be declared by the General Assembly later this year and run from next year, 2025, until 2034. And what has been central to the Permanent Forum is reparatory justice, as we like to call it, or reparations for people of African descent, for histories and legacies of enslavement, of genocide, of institutionalized, legally sanctioned racial segregation and discrimination, also referred to as apartheid, and genocide. And this is a major theme of the Permanent Forum, and I'm sure you have seen that this is a growing theme globally. And I know that there are such conversations also taking place in Canada. This has become a major matter and theme in the US, with several cities and now the state of California, for instance, pursuing seriously policies for reparatory justice or reparations. And this was a central theme of the Durban Conference in South Africa in 2001, and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The issue of reparatory justice is central. And I'm sure you're also familiar with that the Caribbean Community CARICOM of 15 and its 15 member states since 2013 are pursuing reparatory justice with its 10-point plan for reparatory justice and for reparatory justice and development. Now, what is reparatory justice? We on the Permanent Forum, we are in the process of developing a comprehensive human rights-based approach to reparatory justice, also within the framework of the UN Declaration on the Human Rights of People of African Descent, which is currently being drafted by the UN, and it belongs to the mandate of the Permanent Forum to contribute to the drafting of this declaration. And we believe that reparatory justice, together with recognizing and addressing systemic and structural racism against people of African descent, ought to be central to this declaration. And it is certainly central to the work of the Permanent Forum. Now, many of you and many people in general, when they hear the term reparations, they immediately think of it in terms of financial or monetary compensation. And this is a view that, for instance, the new government of the United Kingdom expressed yesterday, I believe it was, where they said that at the forthcoming, soon to happen meeting with the Commonwealth states, that reparations will not be on the agenda for the UK, not something that the UK is interested in discussing, and that they're not interested in any sort of financial compensation for the past, and they want to, as they have said several times previously, they want to look forward to the future. Now, this sort of comment, if you will, is based on a misconception of how, for instance, CARICOM views reparatory justice, and certainly how the Permanent Forum views reparatory justice from a human rights perspective. From a human rights perspective, reparatory justice is primarily about rectifying the legacies and continuations of past injustices and crimes against humanity, and in their place establish systems and structures of dignity, of equality, of the equal enjoyment of human rights. And it is not primarily a matter of financial compensation per se. This is not to say, of course, that if we were to rectify the lasting consequences or legacies of colonialism and its many crimes against humanity in the Caribbean, for instance, and to address the lasting consequences of these past injustices in the Caribbean, as the CARICOM 10-point plan is meant to do. Of course, this is going to cost. And of course, those states who have contributed to these crimes should pay, or should rather be willing to address the legacies of these past injustices. But again, the point here is not the financial compensation or the money per se. No amount of money, no amount of financial compensation can compensate for the tremendous suffering and crimes against humanity that were perpetrated against people of African descent and Africans, of course, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Rather, again, it is a matter of rectifying or correcting the lasting consequences of these crimes. So that is the sort of perspective on reparatory justice that the Permanent Forum endorses, if you will. And we also think that this sort of perspective on reparatory justice should be central to the forthcoming declaration, as I mentioned. Now, we also see reparatory justice as not only a matter that concerns, and this is very important, is not only a matter that concerns Africans and people of African descent. It is a matter that is global, and it is a matter of establishing social and international orders and social and international systems and structures that are equitable and that are firmly based on a respect for everyone's human dignity, rights, and flourishing. And in this sense, too, reparatory justice is central to sustainable development. The two core premises of sustainable development is to bring down the use of natural resources, including greenhouse emissions, to sustainable levels, as we all know, not only in terms of greenhouse emissions, but in terms of other ecological systems and areas, such as our seas, our use of land, our use of forests, and so forth, are being overused and exploited in ways that are not sustainable and that are harming our planet. So that needs to be addressed. And the so-called developed countries, which one must, or the global north as they are also referred to, when referring to the developed world or the global north, one should keep in mind that all so-called developed countries, except for Japan and perhaps Israel, are either European or former European colonial settler countries, and with white majority populations, whereas the great majority of the global south, the so-called developing countries, are countries that most of them have been colonized at some point by European countries, and have majority populations with people of color. And this sort of, and the relationship between the global north and the south, between developed and developing countries, is in many ways structurally unequal. For instance, in the use of natural resources, in how natural resources are used today, we're in the global economy. The use of natural resources in the global south are mostly used in the end to the material and financial benefit to countries and people and actors such as businesses in the global north. The global north has contributed most to greenhouse emissions and the current climate crisis, whereas people in the global south are suffering most from its consequences. And the list goes on. So there's this sort of inequitable relationship between global north and global south countries that are rooted in histories of colonialism. And this needs to be corrected. And this is the second premise of sustainable development. is to create greater equity within and among countries when it comes to socioeconomic development. And in order for there to be universal and global development, these sort of structural inequities between global South and North countries need to be comprehensively, holistically addressed. And reparatory justice is a way, and perhaps and probably most likely the most comprehensive way of recognizing and addressing this situation. So when we talk about reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent, we do also, and it's important that we also have this sort of global view, and that see that these are issues that concerns the health, well-being, and future of the planet and of humanity. Now, I would encourage all of you to be involved in the work of the Permanent Forum, also the work of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent that Barbara will be speaking about, and to attend our annual sessions. And as I always or often like to say, the Permanent Forum will only be as powerful as we, the people, we, civil society, you listening to this call, the United Church of Canada, and others make it. And we make it powerful by engaging in it and by using it to mobilize, to raise our voices, and to demand change, and to hold states accountable for creating the sort of world that we would like to see. I think I will end here, and again, I'm sorry that I was not able to be with you live. I would have loved to speak with you and exchange with you in a Q&A, but hopefully we can make that happen another time. So again, thank you for listening. Thank you for thanks to the United Church of Canada for inviting me. Again, special thanks to you, Adele, and looking forward to seeing you in the future and working with you in the future. Thanks a lot.
A special thank you to Michael for joining us by video and sharing that message. You are welcome to raise questions in the chat. We are going to hear from Barbara Reynolds now live, and she also has lots of insights to share and is open and available for questions. So thank you, and over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Adele. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be bold enough to say that if you have questions about what Michael just said, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. And if not, I'll put them to him when next I see him. I have his email address and I have his WhatsApp. So thank you for asking me. Any questions that you thought that you might wish to ask Michael if he were here? Any burning issues? Or any comments? I'd be happy to convey that to him. And then I can say to him, I told you so, you should have said that.
Okay, so Barbara, there's one question in the chat. There's a wondering if there's a plan to introduce environmental racism in the school system. So
okay,
yes. So
I'll definitely answer that in my few slides. Yes, I'll definitely answer that. So that is Joan Westcott. I hope I've pronounced the family name correctly. Definitely yes. And I hope that I answer that a little bit more explicitly. Okay, so let me crack on. Please feel free to interrupt me. I'm comfortable. And I just wanted to share with you a few things, and I'll go ahead and do just that. So here we are. This is the beginning of your 40 days of engagement, I think, on anti-racism. I said last week that I really don't care about who is racist or not. And I said that deliberately, simply because as good Christians, you know, you can't control what anybody wants to believe. So we have choice. That's one thing the good Lord gave us. So people will choose to believe whatever they wish to believe, and people can choose to be racist or not racist. So I'm not here to fight what people believe, but I am here to fight against discrimination. And so that's where my entry point is. I've put here a defense of the United Nations. So let's have some fun with it. My first point is it's the best we've got. And if it didn't exist, we would create it today. And I would have a good stab of creating it. In fact, in my less sane moments, I've often thought about how I would reorganize the UN to suit myself. Number two, it's a voluntary organization. It's not a super government, and we wouldn't want it to be a super government anyhow. So states gave up or continue to give up a little bit of their sovereignty and bind themselves through declarations and covenants and conventions to work together. Now, I know that that seems like an itsy bitsy thing, but it's a huge thing. It really, really, really is a big thing, because going back to a couple of 1,000 years ago, we bought into this idea about sovereignty, whether it was the city-state or the nation-state. We like sovereignty. And so to give up a little bit of our sovereignty so that we get along is a huge thing. And whenever people bash the UN, which people have a right to do, to bash the UN as much as you can, because we're all members of the UN, I usually say, now, wait a minute. Do you really want a super government? You know, when people ask, so why doesn't the UN do this or the UN should do that? Somebody who could just come into Canada and tell Canada, this is what you should do, this is how you should do it. I don't think that's what we want. And so we need to figure that out. Now, my third point about the UN is that we can't measure what has not happened. We just got, you know, that's the fundamental thing of immunization. Because when we do immunization, we do it on the intention of avoiding widespread disease. Now, who's to tell if you didn't immunize people whether there would have been widespread disease or not? We don't know. However, if history is prologue, we know there are several bullets that we've missed as a human race. And one of them is a third world war. And right now, I think many of us are a little bit anxious about how far are we going to skirt towards the edge of a third world war? How far are we going to go to damage our environment before we pull back? And that's where the UN comes in. So that's my 3 smiley faces. However, it's one vote, one country. Sounds good, right? So if you take Barbados, that has like 350,000 people, it has the same vote as China. One vote. But behind that one vote, as you probably would imagine, there is a lot of pressure. And so big countries, rich countries, pressure countries, less developed countries. So they may vote, they do, but it's still one vote, one country under pressure. So I've given that not quite a smiley face, the opposite. There are lots of deal making. Oh my goodness me, lots of deal making, lots of wrangling, lots of talk, but not always walking. 2. So it's what we've got. So let's get to work, use it. And as a former staff member of a UN agency, I can tell you that it works. It's not perfect, but it works. And the more we use it, the better it gets. So you're here and you're embarking on your annual 40 days of active engagement in anti-racism advocacy and commitment. So I wanted to touch a little bit on the nexus between racism, discrimination, and development. And as you can see, as I have up here, racism is individual, it's institutional, it's structural, it's systemic. It's economic, it's social, it's cultural, and it's political, and it impacts on our development. It results in discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Now, what's this related intolerance? That's a big unknown X, but we're sure about xenophobia. And I come back to the root word of the word xenophobia, where I think that in the 21st century where we are now, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that phobia originated as a fear. And so while today it's about hatred and disdain, there's still elements of fear. And I am astounded. I am truly, truly, truly astounded that people would be afraid of a Black woman like myself. And I look in the mirror and I say, but why are you afraid of me? What do you think I'm going to do? I mean, what is it about me that scares the living daylights out of some people? But it's true that there are people who fear Black people, African people, people of African descent. And we have to ask, why is there a fear? What is this to be fearful about? I have a couple of ideas that we can share at some other point in time. And so we come down to the focus of our work here, which is this work around anti-Black racism or Afrophobia. Ladies and gentlemen, my premise here is that Afrophobia is not the same as xenophobia. Xenophobia is about the other, and we know that. Afrophobia is really about the fear of Black people, of people of African descent, people whose ancestors came from the continent of Africa, and what it means for us today. So, to what end is your 40 days of engagement in anti-racism work, Adele? I would hazard a guess that you're talking about the fulfillment and or the realization of the human rights of people of African descent. It's critical that we understand that this is a global issue, which is why I put the globe there. It's not about Canada, it's not about the US, it's not about Alaska, it's not about Vancouver or British Columbia. It is something that has enveloped the whole world, whether we like it or not. And one of the things that COVID brought to our attention is that we cannot separate ourselves from the other. And so we're locked into this earth. Now, I don't know if Elon Musk is going to succeed in taking some of us off to Mars or wherever, but right now we're locked into this earth. It's a beautiful earth. It has enough food to feed all of us. It has enough space for all of us to build mansions. I don't mean you Christians, just the one up there. But right here on earth, it has enough space for all of us to have mansions. And there's enough ocean if you want to go ski or sail or fish or whatever. But yet still on a daily basis, billions of people live in poverty. Millions of children can't go to school. Many, many millions more don't have access to potable water within walking distance from their homes. They live in lousy houses that make them vulnerable to the elements. They are undernourished or just not able to feed themselves. Some people actually don't have sufficient clothes, especially with climes. They have spaces, they don't have green spaces, they don't have leisure, they don't have peace in which to make their own choices. And so this idea about the fulfillment and realization of the human rights of people of African descent is situated and say it's not just about people of African descent, because when we advocate and when we work for the realization of the human rights of people of African descent, the whole world benefits. Now, if you don't believe me, go back a little bit to history. Those of us who are feminists or gender specialists, you recall that when we advocated for the rights of women and girls, men benefited. Because that's how it works, you know. It's a question of the impact that we have on the whole society. When we advocated for the work for the rights of disabled people, everybody benefits. Now you think about some of the innovations that we have because people are disabled. Think about ramps. How often do we use ramps? Okay, ramps were really intended for people with disabilities so you can roll them, but we use them all the time. I don't want to be lifting my suitcase through an airport, so it has wheels and I go up and down ramps. Those ramps were actually intended for wheelchairs, but we use them, we benefit from them without even realizing just how, when we advocate for the rights of one group, one small group, how we all benefit. And so it's critical. Okay, so civil rights, political rights, economic rights, social, cultural rights. Everybody knows about the two international covenants. They were entered into force, they were declared in 1966, entered into force in 1976, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's interesting, the history behind this, because the people in the Western countries pushed for civil and political. The people in the Eastern countries, that's how we developed, you know, we divided up our world back then, pushed for economic, social, and cultural rights. And it seems to me that if we look a little bit about our history, those who pushed for civil and political rights did us a because they were richer countries, they were powerful countries, and they kind of put in a hierarchy of rights, that civil and political rights were more important than economic, social, and cultural rights. That's not true. Our lived reality is that you could have all the civil and political rights that you wish, but if you don't have economic rights, if you're not economically viable, you don't have social development or cultural development, what's the point? What's the point of being able to vote if you can't afford to get the bus to go to the polling station? So you have the right to vote, but you can't vote because you've never been to school. So you wouldn't be able to get that ID card that says you can read, write, and do math, and therefore you can't vote. And so one of the principles of human rights is that rights are indivisible and interrelated. And I want to emphasize that point because you're not going to believe what I'm going to say. But there are countries that in the negotiation of the Declaration on for the promotion of the rights of people of African descent, Japan, for example, says that they object to including the right to development in a declaration for people of African descent. And it blows your mind away about the ends to which people will go to achieve what they want to achieve. So the question, therefore, is this a question of individual or collective? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to put it to you that there is no distinction between individual and collective rights. Because we're here talking about the subject because people of African descent, Black people, whatever you want to call, are looked at as a collective. And so individual rights, collective rights, doesn't really matter. But there are countries that object to the concept of collective rights for people of African descent. Countries like the US, UK, the EU, as we go through the negotiation for that declaration, they raise their flag every time it comes up and say things like, well, my delegation does not see how people of African descent could have collective rights. We understand it for indigenous people, but we don't people of African descent. So What are the working group's 4 contemporary priorities? Racial justice. And we know that this is about recognition, justice, and development. That's what the decade was about. And when we did our review, we all realized that not much was done. Not many countries invested. They didn't even promulgate it. So our advocacy of the last 3 or 4 years has been, there must be a second decade, but when there is a second decade, we want in the first instance that member states will promulgate it. Go back and tell every citizen there is a decade for people of African descent. Not go back and tell Black people that. Go back and tell every citizen, because it's everybody's business. That's one. And then secondly, to invest in the decade. Invest in people, invest in structures, invest in policies. And then third, very, very importantly, of activists and advocates to speak out. They must be protected at home, and they shouldn't be punished for speaking out. So racial justice, reparatory justice, righting historical wrongs, enslavement, colonization, segregation, apartheid, whatever it is we want to call it, we know about it. Environmental justice, this answers the question that Ms. Westcott posed, that yes, environmental justice is a priority for the working group, as it is for many, many people around the world. And we see this as putting down a marker for future generations. I'm sorry about the S there, because we can't wait for them to wake up 50 years from now and say, why didn't we do X or Y? So whether it's about clean air, potable water, cities that are sinking because they're on the periphery, whether it's about the blue economy or the green economy, environmental justice is a priority. And then, of course, digital justice, dealing with the knowns and unknowns. So last week, I presented the working group's 2024 thematic report to the Human Rights Council. It was on digitalization, AI, and new and emerging technologies. I have to tell you, I felt very loved last week because it was the first time that, I didn't have a barrage of people saying, I don't agree with you, because interestingly, every delegation that took the floor recognized and accepted what we said, because we have a sense, all of us as human beings, that we've left this just a tad too late, and that the private sector has leapt ahead of states without any regulation, without any ethics, without any sanctions. And so we're just trying to catch up. And there are many knowns, but there are also many unknowns in digital justice. And we see this as kind of a template for our work for the next few years. So what does the working group do? Well, it was established as a Durban mechanism in 2002, so we're 22 years old. 2 years ago, we did a 20-year report where we looked at all of the thematic reports that we presented. For example, last year we presented a thematic report on economic empowerment of people of African descent, the year before on children of African descent. And so we have this body of research, of studies, evidence-driven conclusions, findings, and recommendations that we've shared with the world. So we're 5 members from the 5. Put this down here just for fun. So, the UN is an interesting place. So, of course, the UN has regions like the Africa region. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. The Africa region is pretty straightforward. And then it has Latin America and the Caribbean. That's easy. Then it has Asia. That's also pretty easy. And then it has the Middle East and North Africa. That's also very, very easy. And then it has an interesting 5th region. It's called Western Europe. And guess who is in this region? Well, you've got the Western European countries, not Eastern Europe. You've got Japan, you've got Australia, you've got New Zealand, you've got the US, Canada, and the UK. Nice region, huh? Geographic. And then the working group has some instruments at its disposal. So here are the instruments that the working group has. Research and studies. I just mentioned our thematic reports. We have country fact-finding visits. Last week, I presented our report on our fact-finding visit to Norway. And we take this very, very, very seriously. And sometimes I am surprised that governments are surprised when we point out what's wrong at home, and that racism is actually very much part of the warp and the weave of countries. And quote unquote, even a country like Norway, when you go there and you look at what's happening, or you go to a country like Australia and we see the indefinite detention of South Sudanese migrants who were taken to Australia to have a chance at a new life. And we see that South Sudanese men of Africa are disproportionately in prison with indefinite term sunset clause. They have gone there based on a character test, so no due process. It's important, these fact-finding visits. We only do 2 a year, but they do have some impact. We do technical support and academic visits where we train people, we engage in scholarly discussions and discourse as we advocate. We do communications, and these are advocacy, like I'm doing this evening, allegation letters where we actually write to member states and say, based on the evidence, this is what we found, and we ask them to account for what we have found. We do urgent appeals. We intervene in court cases. We file amicus briefs, sometimes to stay decisions, sometimes to contribute towards decisions. And we do press briefings. And then a couple of final slides. Key moments ahead of us. The close of the current decade. I think on November 6, 7, I think 7 or 8, there'll be a formal high-level meeting in New York to close the current decade. And then we hope for a second decade, and I've already said what we want from there. There's the unfinished work of recognition, justice, and development from the first decade, but there's work ahead of us to do in terms of reparatory justice, in terms of environmental justice, in terms of digital justice. And ladies and gentlemen, by saying that it doesn't exclude gender justice, it doesn't exclude anything. It's just a question of finite time, finite resources, and where we choose to place our emphasis. And then, so I represent the working group on these negotiations, as I've mentioned to you, and it's coming along, but there's a big fight ahead, because if a country like Japan tells us that they object to the inclusion of a right to development and a declaration of the rights of people of African descent, we do have some concerns about that. Or other delegations say they object to the inclusion of the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. So you understand the impact and the import of this declaration. And then our 35th session, as you can see, we've been at this 20 years with a body of work behind us. Our 35th session will take place in New York at the UN headquarters, December 2 to 6. And the focus is on principles, provisions, and pathways to reparatory justice for people of African descent. And we'll look at representation. So lots of people talking about reparations and reparatory justice. But who is representing who, and why, and how, and where, and when? So that, for example, when some countries say that they are advocating for reparatory justice and they're repressing Black people in their own countries, I have a problem with that. So representation is an important issue. And then the whole thing about recognition, acknowledgement, and apology. What's the value of this and what's the utility? Not emotionally, but legally. Okay, so the King of Netherlands has apologized, but in July, the Parliament of the Netherlands voted not to deal with reparatory justice. So the repair of ways of being, living, knowing, and living together. And I'm going to say very, very publicly, and I've said it before, Black people have some repair to do in the house, at home, some housekeeping. There's still too much distance between Caribbean Blacks and American Blacks and Canadian Blacks and African Blacks and a whole deal of nonsense, in my humble opinion. Reimagining and reshaping language and education and spaces and places. Yes, reparations, restitution, and the return of artifacts and assets. Last year at our session on economic empowerment, we had the Master of Jesus College at Cambridge University talking about their work in returning a Benin bronze. And ladies and gentlemen, I know for a fact that in the basement of all of these big museums in developed countries and in universities, lots of artifacts and assets that were stolen from, not just from Africa, but elsewhere. Then the reform of institutions, laws, policies, structures, systems, and practices. And of course, at the apex of all of this has to be not just for the symbolism, but an emblematic case of Haiti. Haiti that secured independence, that they fought for independence in 1804 from France, and then were forced to pay France for the loss of their property. And then, of course, being forced to bank with France and all of that. And so reparatory justice for Haiti is a global priority. And it's not just about the symbolism and the instrumentality, but it simply says to all of us, if we have to achieve reparatory justice, Haiti has to be a big part of that. And then finally, remembering Durban and the centrality of the DDPA. And so my final slide to you as the United Church of Canada, what would Jesus do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Very much appreciated your overview of this part of the UN. There is another question that has come up in the chat, and everyone is welcome to add additional questions to the chat based on what you've heard from Barbara or what you heard from Michael before. But the additional question that's in the chat right now is around reparations. And it names that the idea of reparations to African people or people of African descent is an idea that is long overdue. The UK has indicated they're not interested in discussing financial reparations. So are they willing to consider other types of reparations? And what about other countries such as the United States? And we can add Canada to that too. So is there anything?
No country has come forward yet and said that they are willing to really engage around reparations because they know there's a cost. And there's a Judge Robinson who has worked out an economic cost, doing the figures in terms of the loss of life, the loss of liberty, the loss of income, compensatory figures, you know, the typical legal thing. It's a colossal amount of money. Will they deal with it? Eventually they will. One of the beautiful things, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that I'm sitting here this evening tells me that all of these things are possible. If you think about some of the things that you have seen in your lifetime, I remember being glued to the television, watching Nelson Mandela walk out of prison. I sat like that next to my two sisters, just like this. Wow. I've been to that island and seen Nelson Mandela's the cell. And ladies and gentlemen, the sun on that limestone will blind you. And imagine a gentleman goes through that for more than 2 decades and then is able to walk out with his dignity and refrain from causing a civil war. That a lot of what we have seen in our lifetime is possible to be replicated in different ways. So I do believe that these countries will have to deal with reparatory justice. They have to deal with it because they have benefited from it, okay? And the same time they were benefiting from it cumulatively, in having a multiplier effect, people of African descent were being deprived cumulatively with a multiplier effect. And so at some point in the future, countries will have to deal with it. I don't know when, but it will happen. 2 points for me as a Black person. Black people have to be prepared to deal with it. I was in Accra last year, and as I'm coming back to the hotel, there's this lovely young man. You know, after a while, they get friendly. They ask you, how's your day, and what have you, and what have you. And, you know, I love to chat with young people. So I said to this kid, he asked me how was I there. I said, well, I'm a bit tired and what have you. So he asked me, you know, was I where? I said, no, I was at a conference on reparatory justice that the president of Ghana had convened with the AU, blah, blah, blah. And you know what he says to me? I want my check. And I had to stop right there in the elevator with the laptop here and a bunch of papers here. I needed to stop and do a lesson right there and explain to this young man it's not about a check and that a check was not going to materialize into his hands. And I don't know if he would want to check. So I spent about a good 20 minutes trying to work with this young man, and I hope it sticks. The point I'm making here is that we have a lot of education to do, not just of ourselves, but to those people from whom we claim justice. It's not about the check. It's not only about the check. And if we got the check, what would we do with it? And who says what the check should be? All of those things need to be discussed, and they need to be discussed rationally and clearly. Apart from the governments, two of my favorite people, institutions, from whom we must claim reparatory justice would be the insurance companies like Lloyd that built its wealth on ensuring the property, the human property of various people, ensuring them against the loss of their human property. I don't know why Lloyd's, let me not go there. The insurance people, that's one. The banking people. The Dutch East India Company that was the precursor for where we are. France, West African countries, they were forced to bank their money in French francs. So all of this mess has to do with governments, but it also has to do with the private sector, which continues to exploit. And then it has to do with religious autocracies. So the church has always been complicit, Whatever denomination, I don't care, and I know the church has been complicit. And not only has the church been complicit in colonization, segregation, colorism, racism, anything else. So these are the big three, the kind of private sector people, the banking, insurance company, the miners, the what have you, the religious autocracies, and then the governments. Now, some governments will argue, as the UK does, we're good people, okay? We can't be accountable for our ancestors. I agree. As long as you admit that you're a beneficiary of the cumulative wealth and privilege of your ancestors, and I'm a beneficiary for the lack of, or for the cumulative deprivation of my ancestors. If we can agree with that, we have a match made in heaven. And on this basis, we can go ahead. What I would love to see, however, is a degree of civility. I would love to see a degree of rational thought. And I'd love for people of African descent to really, really figure out when it does happen, are you going to be prepared for it? Because, I mean, Hollywood is littered with rich Black people who became declared bankruptcy after, you know, a couple of years because they just weren't prepared. So we have to be prepared. And as I said before, that work has to be done within the Black community. So if you know any Black people, what a sister said, just don't wait for it to happen, go prepare. You know, they usually tell you if you're praying for rain, take out your umbrella. So if we're looking for reparatory justice, let's get ourselves organized. And I say this to Black people all the time. So I'm not just saying it because I say to Black people, our act together. So it is overjoyed about the school systems. School systems are not monochromatic, so they vary over time and space. I am disappointed at what I see in some parts of, particularly the US, in terms of kind of putting a little bit of a poison pen into the minds of young children. I figure it will reverse itself at some point in time, but I'm concerned about the impact on young children who instinctively believe what their teachers and parents say while they're still in their formative years and how that will affect them. I do think that our textbooks are horrible because they just don't do justice to history in a civil manner, in a rational manner, in an honest manner. And the downside of that is if you look at kids who are, say, 18 to 25, 27 now, they've lost kind of their faith in us because we just have messed up royally. And so getting back to education systems that educate people for the future, that are relevant, that are focused on citizenship, on employability, on being able to be employed, whether it's self-employed or whatever, about philanthropy and volunteerism and community, we lost a little bit of that and we need to find it again. So the school systems, definitely. Whomever can, it's a job that has to be done. And yes, there is no harm in putting environmental racism in there. I just want to say one thing about this racism thing before I forget, Adele. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a black and white matter. I think instinctively, because colonizers and enslavers were white, that people of African descent speak to people of European descent, white people, about racism. But we must also accept that racism comes in many different shapes and sizes and hues and textures. And while my working group focuses on people of African descent, we do work very closely with a special rapporteur on racism. So there's racism across the globe. You got Black racists too, so we just have to deal with them. Asians, you know, and we see this coming out now because we've started to speak to ourselves in terms of color. So there are blacks and whites and browns and whatever. Simply a mask to say that we've kind of accepted this thing and we're trying now to deal with it and touch it. People of African descent currently are being exploited by non-white people who are just as hegemonic as the former enslavers and colonizers. If you look at mining, if you look at extraction, so I would stop there when it comes to environmental racism and say it's not a black-white issue, either literally or metaphorically.
Thank you, Barbara. There are two more questions that have emerged. So one,
Adele, we just don't need questions. We're comfortable with comments, and I don't. Or why did you say that? That doesn't make sense. We're comfortable with all of that too.
Yes. Okay. So people are welcome to make comments. And so far, though, what has emerged are questions. So here are the questions that are emerged, still on the theme of reparations and reparatory justice. And so what is posed here is, in seeking reparatory justice, whether in the giving end or receiving end, is it not important to understand it is not individual but rather collective? Is not individual desire to acquire more, such as more power, wealth, territory, resources, and so on, the root cause of what causes the need for reparatory justice?
I think the second question is difficult to answer. I truly don't know. Is that a moral issue or a social issue or economic issue? I don't know. I know a lot of people who will prefer to sit under a coconut tree and drink pina coladas. Wealth, not everybody wants wealth. Territory, not everybody wants territory. In fact, I would hazard a guess that it's really a minority of people in every country, every race, that seeks this kind of more power, more wealth, more territory. I've lived around the world, and everywhere I've gone, I think I've found that people just want to be happy, have a family, feed them, go on holiday, whatever a holiday turns out to be, and see their children's children. That's very important, I think, in every society. This concept of seeing my children's children is very important. So I'm not sure about the second question. I'm not sure how much philosophy is in that or what have you. So I'll respectfully just leave it at that. The first question, absolutely. And that's why I raised the issue of rights, because when the EU says to, the plenary in the negotiations about the declaration that they understand collective rights of indigenous people or indigenous peoples, but they don't see collective rights for people of African descent, I get very, very worried. Because if we're negotiating a declaration, people of African descent, that's by default a collective. We're Black people. People of African descent is already a collective. They were enslaved as a group. And so I think sometimes we hide behind these very intellectual things about whether anybody other than indigenous people could have collective rights. Of course they have. I mean, everybody has collective rights. My high school people think they have rights. I just went to my high school's 150th anniversary a couple months ago, and we were all crazy talking about school and walking around my hometown saying we're Bishop's girls and all that kind of jazz and making a big noise and big fuss because we felt we were special. Now, probably we're not, but it's a collective thing. And so I think we do operate in the collective and in the individual, all of us. The Church of Canada is a collective. That's why you're gathered here. And so anybody who says to me that they don't believe in collective anything, I think is just not being real. For people of African descent, it's important that we deal with the collective impact of racism, discrimination, enslavement, colonization, fracking, digital inequities, because we're suffering as a group. And ladies and gentlemen, I'll speak as a Black woman. In many ways, it doesn't matter how educated I am, how well I speak or don't speak, whether I dress properly or don't dress properly. I will always be viewed as a Black woman. And so as a Black person, I wear that in my skin. It's in my genes. It's in my brain cells. It's not a question of whether I want to be or not. It is who I am. It is my lived experience. The same way for a white person or any other person, it's a reality. And therefore, my job, my role is not to question whether we're a collective or not. It's to say then, how do we, as people of African descent, as Black people, how do we relate with other people of other races or other colors? And that's just one dimension. I was at a meeting last week in gender and intersectionality. So it's not just the color of my skin or the texture of my hair, but it's my gender, it's my socioeconomic status, it's my sexual orientation, it's my education, I sat right next to the special rapporteur on racism. She's a Dalit. Okay. So in India, it's all one race, but try explaining caste to anyone outside of India. And I continue to try to figure out, how did India arrive at a point where you have one caste that is untouchable or invisible? We're human beings, and so we arrived there. And so I think the collective is non-negotiable. It exists. And I don't mean as a big philosophical, psychological construct. That's just how we mediate our reality. We do so as individuals as well as collectives. Everybody on the platform is Canadian except for me. So that's who you are. That's what I am. I'm not Canadian. And so for you, I might be the other. But if we look at it other ways, there's some men, I'm not a male. There's some women, and we can go down the line. So that's where we are.
Right. Thank you, Barbara. There's a comment now, comment as well as a question. So the comment is an expression of thanks for unpacking all that is involved in reparatory justice and the links to environmental racism and broader questions of justice. So noting that thanks, and also that that's a lot to digest. So that's one comment. In addition, there's also a question. And the question is it possible for the UN to create a curriculum that could be used anywhere in the world or by national or provincial ministries of education in a way that can be integrated with the local curriculum?
Good question. UNESCO has done an excellent job on some of these. So if you go to the UNESCO website, they have done a lot of work on memory in terms of enslavement with a lot of resources. The UNESCO is really, really good, really, really good with the work that they prepare. The question is always, when you take that resource to your local school system, how can it be integrated? Is it going to be a yes from the Board of Education or a no? With all that we've packed into, grade school curricula these days, I mean, it's no longer reading, writing, and arithmetic. So they've got to do, I don't know, nutrition, civics. How do you integrate it? So it's there. How do you integrate it? A couple of other people, academics or others interested, are just getting together to do a global African studies curriculum. Now, this is in part a pushback from what we see happening in the US, where ethnic studies have been perhaps given a bad name and are being annihilated, aka unfunded. And therefore, if you're unfunded, you can't run a program. So they've just got together to do that. And I'm reminded that I've been told not to say they, so it really should be we. I'm not an academic, so I will, make my little inputs on the side from a curriculum perspective, from a human rights perspective, but they're doing that. And the idea is that this would be a resource that's available to the public just to revisit the whole question about Black studies, about African studies. And ladies and gentlemen, if you go back 20, 30 years, you remember we had Asian studies, we had First People studies, we had all kinds of studies. And the idea is that by default, it was the dominant culture, and therefore we needed to look at minority cultures and history. And so it's always a good thing. And I hope that that will materialize. And I hope that this vein of thing that's happening mostly in the US about, I don't know, critical race theory and taking books off of curriculum and all kinds of interesting things. I hope that that wanes and that there could be some possibilities that people can again talk about issues that are dear to their heart and write books And I'll be the first to say that I can't read every book, so some books might be offensive to me, but I don't think we need to read every book that's ever written. But certainly, I think people who want to write books should be able to write books, and then we should exercise our choice about what we read. And certainly, if we have a minor who is under 18, we provide guidance to that person. So that's just my little 2 cents on that one. But certainly, we want that to come back. I'm wondering, yeah, I think I dealt with that. Look, rich countries are going to go to every environmental summit and try to railroad it. Okay, so if we look at environmental racism, we don't necessarily have to call it environmental racism, but we can certainly talk to our children about environmental issues. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not just in the school system. Most of us have scouts, pathfinders, master guides, Lions clubs, you name it. We do get together. And so thank God for the internet. The church can educate its congregants about the environment, even if we don't go to environmental racism. I personally prefer the term environmental justice more than environmental racism. But that's maybe splitting a hair too much. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do so. And talk about the environment, talk about digital justice. My goodness gracious me, the crazy stuff that's happening with AI is scary. It truly is scary. And I'm hoping that governments step up and put in place a regulatory regime. They put in place standards. They put in place sanctions. So that's what I would say.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. We are nearing the end of our time together, and I wondered if you might be willing to share some words of encouragement or challenge to the people who are gathered here. What might be some suggested actions that people might be able to take, recognizing you have church leaders here from across the country. Based on what we've heard, what are some suggested actions that people could do in their own communities?
Thank you, Adele. My last slide, what would Jesus do? I really do mean that. It's not just a sticker. I come from a church where every quarter we have a lesson. And we study it together wherever you are in the world, okay? I'm a practicing Seventh-day Adventist. My siblings and I, my girl siblings and I, on Friday evening get together wherever we are in the world on Zoom, and we study the lesson together. And then we gossip and we talk and we do all kinds of crazy things. So for example, on Friday evening, I was in Geneva and I set my alarm for 5 minutes to 1 so I could get up at 1 o'clock and be on Zoom with my sisters from 1 until 3 a.m. because that time is precious for me. So what do we do there? We look at what the Bible says about a number of issues and we try to extrapolate in a concrete way about what that means for us. My sense is that that's one of the pathways for Christians to really go back to the Bible and say, what does the Bible say about this? What would Jesus do? And he's left sufficient markers for us to be able to parse that. The Bible has, for me, an answer to every single question or dilemma that I encounter, including how much ice cream should I eat at any given time, and whether I should just completely come off chocolates as I'm trying to do. But, you know, as I pass through, when you pass through the airports, they just bombard you, right? There was a question just now, should I be buying any more clothes this year when I can't wear all the clothes that I have? Those are the mundane things. The serious things, would be, when I look at another person, regardless of, or because of the person's race or gender or sexual orientation or disability or class or caste or socioeconomic status or level of education, what do I owe the other person? So I need to pay my debt to what I owe the other person first before I expect the person to give me what's my due. And I think that as a Christian, the debt that I owe the other person is, first of all, recognition that that person is a fellow traveler, as a human being. And second, that I owe the person a duty of care, at the minimum to do no harm. And if that's all I can do, that's fine. But if I can do more, that's pretty good. I owe the person kind of like a cheerfulness, kind of like, not making it too burdensome, if you know what I mean. Yeah, I think I would leave it there because, we could argue. I mean, my siblings and I and my brother-in-law, we argue about, what a particular passage meant. But we do that mostly for fun. At the end of the day, we have one another's back. And we will, we will back one another. And that's, how do we step it out? When I meet someone in the airport, when I look at you, whom do I see? And basically, I have this habit of telling myself that, God really, really loved Hitler and he died for Hitler. And therefore, if he could die for Hitler, then who am I to judge? So that's what I would leave for you, because ultimately, as a collective tonight on this platform, you have presented as the United Church of Canada. And I do acknowledge that each of us belongs in multiple collectives. So, family, school, political party, whatever. We're not going to perhaps get it 100% right, but I do hope that we could at least try to think about what Jesus would do were he here in the 21st century, with all of the privilege that we have, all of the blessings that we have, and try to diminish the confusion and chaos we've created as human beings. So thank you very much for sharing the last 90 minutes with me. Thank you for walking the journey. It is a journey. I hope you keep walking. I hope you keep focused on what you think is right under God. And I'm sure that we'll come out at the end of it for better people. And thank you, Adele, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to join you and a privilege to be here. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you so much, Barbara. This was excellent. We are so thankful for your insights and all that you've shared today, and thankful also for Michael earlier coming to us by video. Friends, we would invite all of you tonight to offer your feedback on tonight's event. There's a very short survey that I've just put in the chat here. It will only take 2 minutes. If you're willing to pull that up and do that on SurveyMonkey as you go, that would be wonderful. And thank you all for being here. You're welcome back anytime for the continued live events that will continue on Tuesdays at 7 o'clock in the evening. And please feel free to sign up for the newsletter to stay up to date on all that will be happening in these 40 days and the very many ways to engage. So thank you once again for being here. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks to Barbara and also to Brian, who was doing tech in the background. So blessings to you all.
Take care, everybody. I'm going to leave your platform. Have a good evening. I hope everybody had a nice Thanksgiving yesterday, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the week. Take care now. Bye-bye.